Welcome to this Thoughtexchange virtual event. My name is Kyle, and there are probably many of you who I know and many who I do not. So for those who I do know, great to have you back. And for those who I've never met before, welcome, and hope that get to know you as time goes on here. You're going to see three faces on your screen here, and you're going to hear from all of us throughout the course of the next 45 minutes. Wanted to introduce to all of you Mr. Jonathan Costa, Senior. Mr. Costa is the Assistant Executive Director for EdAdvance, which is a regional education service center in Connecticut. Recently, Mr. Costa was the architect behind not one, but two statewide exchanges in Connecticut. And so he's here to talk today about the conversations that have taken place in those exchanges, what the data has looked like, and what that means looking forward for planning as far as specifically around returning to school. And this exchange has actually captured the hearts and minds of our company as well, which is why our CEO, Dave McLeod, is on here as well. Dave heard about this event and just really wanted to be here to honor Jonathan and to be a part of this conversation. So we're really happy to have both of them here today. As we are going through this event, if you'd like to participate on the online conversation, our hashtags are TE Virtual Events and hashtag TEVE. We'd love to connect with you on any social media that you are using right now. With that, I would like to once again, for those of you who have just joined, welcome. Glad that you're here, and I'm going to hand it over to our CEO. Dave McLeod in just a moment. Dave and Jonathan are going to have a bit of a conversation around the events that took place in Connecticut, and then we are going to come back and we're actually going to have a live exchange. This is where we're going to invite you to ask your questions. We're going to crowdsource questions from the group that are most relevant to everybody, and we're going to take some time at the end to go through those questions to find out what's to really answer the burning questions that are most compelling to everybody. So with that, I'll hand it over to Dave.
Thanks, Kyle. And awesome to see just about 70 people here. Fantastic. I'm happy to be part of the conversation. And I think it's my responsibility that when gathering together on a day like today, what I'd like to do is I'd actually like to start off our session today just with a minute of silence and solidarity in that we're gathering today. And I'd like to just take a moment of peaceful protest and join in. So before we start, 1 minute, please, of silence before we begin. Thank you for that. Starting in a minute is by no means adequate to represent the grieving and pain that's happening out there in the world right now, but I feel that we should all do our part whenever possible. The next piece that I'd like to do before I get into the story with Jonathan is that I also think that the theme of what we're talking about right now is really about listening. For those of you that joined in partway through that, we were just doing a minute of solidarity. And what I'd like to do actually is start, because I think really one of the biggest shifts that's happening right now across the planet is the emphasis of voice, and not overlooking opportunities. And so before we actually have a conversation with Jonathan, this group of, we're now 80 strong education leaders from across North America. And we have superintendents here, representative directors, principals, people from districts, coast to coast. And I'd really like to start with a conversation of what's on your hearts and minds today as an education leader. So what I'll invite you to do is you can pull out your phone. It's the best way to participate, because then you don't navigate away from this window. Pull out your phone, and you don't actually have to take a picture of the QR code, you just touch it. And in the chat, there will be a link that you can just press in order to participate in this. But as a practice, I just really want us to check in first on what's on everybody's minds, and then we'll actually get into the conversation. And I'm thrilled to be able to talk with Jonathan about that. I'm just gonna skip to Discover just for one moment. And I'm gonna keep it open. And the other thing I can commit to is we'll send this out to this group, the results of this. Equity in action coming up to the very top. I just want to touch in on a few of them. How do we reopen schools safely? Our communities are hurting, and we can't actually gather to talk about it. Anything you see in here, Jonathan, you want to comment on?
No, it's just very similar to the tone of the conversation we've been having here in Connecticut on a couple of different topics.
Yeah.
The safety specifically, and concern, and wanting to reach out to be with peers and our students, but not being able to, as underlying frustration currently, obviously. Yeah.
Listen, everyone, thank you for participating in that. And I agree with you, Jonathan. And I think that's a good segue for us to get into the conversation. So one thing I want to point out is just the importance of gathering and hearing voice from people. And back us up before, so we ended up having this statewide conversation from Thoughtexchange. We had over 1 million thoughts rated in a single exchange over a few days, which is a record for us, which was quite a thing for our development team to be able to manage. Back us up though. So maybe just give everyone, we're 90 strong now. Give them a sense of your role and what happened in that first exchange. Unpack that story with that first district and what that looked like.
Sure. And I would just reframe it. I wasn't really the architect as much as I was the connector. You know, I plug the thing into the wall, and the existing network of educators in Connecticut really took over and did the rest of it. So in my role, we have a district here in Connecticut that we are doing a curriculum revision project with, and we had an assignment to try to craft back to school units for this district, because we're doing other curriculum work with them. And so we thought we would do an exchange with the staff in that district around their feelings about going back to school. So we get a sense of what we would build into those units to make them responsive to their concerns as they think about going back to school. And this was back in April, when we still were thinking we might go back this year. And so we did an exchange with that district, and the intensity of the anxiety and trepidation about going back was just so overwhelming and intense that it took us back as a team. We were thinking about educational feedback, and what we got was health and safety feedback on a scale that we hadn't really anticipated. And so I took that data and shared it with my executive director, who's part of a network of 5 other executive directors of the regional service center system here in Connecticut, and said, you ought to take a look at this. This is very significant, and it'd be interesting for us to see if other districts of different sizes, the district we're working in has an urban profile, if everybody feels this way, because if they do, you know, there's no way you're going back this school year, and it may even wash over into next. So my executive director, Dr. Jeff Kitching, shared that data profile with the Connecticut State Commissioner of Education, Dr. Miguel Cardona, and it had the same impact on sort of both of them that it had on me. And Dr. Cardona basically said, we should ask everybody if they feel this way in this community, we should see if that's a statewide feeling, because at that time, the statewide committee who was planning on whether schools would reopen was meeting, and this was important data for them to have in their consideration of that. So pretty quickly, I worked with your team at Thoughtexchange to put together a private room that was going to be dedicated to a statewide exchange versus an exchange that we just managed through our own agency. And the 6 executive directors pushed it out to all their superintendents, and their superintendents pushed it out to all their parents and staff. And we just sort of sat back, and in that first 72 hours, I'm used to watching exchanges that have, you know, a few hundred participants, a few hundred thoughts, and a few thousand ratings. And, you know, the thing I see in my head is that odometer just spinning over. I mean, the reaction was dramatic and just as impactful on a statewide basis as it was on a local basis. Very similar findings. And very quickly, they realized that there just was no way to practically overcome that a sense of anxiety for health and safety for this spring. And we ought to be thinking about that even as we plan to come back in the fall.
That's so, thanks. And for those, there's people here that run exchanges all the time. And there's people on the call that don't know what that means to run an exchange. So just to unpack that, it's the same with the first group and the second group. I mean, what's the question, or what's the question you asked? And then I'll get you to segue. So what's the question you asked first in that small single district? And then why don't you go ahead and share kind of the process with the bigger district? And I know you have a few slides, but maybe just unpack, like, what does that mean to do an exchange for those that are brand new to the concept?
So, I mean, essentially, and I've had the great good fortune to work with Thoughtexchange for the last 3 years. So we have used it as a tool to listen to our own employees. We've used it as a tool to help our districts listen to their constituents. And then we've used it as a tool to help us learn to facilitate processes that we're doing for districts. So in building the profile of the graduate, or issues around reopening our own building during this current pandemic. So generally, when we think about using Exchange, we really try to think about an open-ended question that will give us information that we don't really know what we're going to get. I mean, I think if you're using Thoughtexchange to validate a predetermined notion versus asking an open-ended question where you really can listen and learn, the power of the content, I think, is proportional to the sort of the courageousness of the question. If you really open yourself to listen and you ask truly open-ended questions, then people are free to type in whatever they want, to express whatever is on their mind. And then you get a sense of how the community feels reflective of that. And so when we asked the first question to our single district, it was, what concerns, questions, or ideas do you have when you think about going back to school? That was it. And it was sort of concerns and ideas to sort of give it both the positive and the negative, whatever you want. And as you'll see in the slides, it came back essentially 95% about health, safety, managing protocols. How do we do this? It doesn't matter what you do. I'm at risk. I can't go back. So, I mean, it was unambiguous in the first exchange. So we really weren't sure whether or not local context would impact that. So really we asked almost the exact same question in the statewide exchange. And we're really paying attention to whether the size of a community would impact their concerns. And as it turned out, size of community really had no difference. They were the message of that big first exchange was Maslow beats Bloom every time. If people don't feel safe, and you see it outside your windows today, if you don't feel safe, you can't have the space you need to think, to learn, to be reflective, and to grow. And it was an unambiguous message.
Thanks. So I just wanted to double click on a few things that you said. One is the openness and of a question, the correlation to courage. I really believe that. And at this time, leaders need to be courageous. And asking for concerns and ideas, I believe, is an open sort of question. So maybe with that, let's segue into, so I want to share with the people that are here, my perspective on this is, hey, there's this great exchange running today. There's lots of them being run, to just ask people what their concerns or ideas are around things. And then it was like, this really had a bit of a interesting result. We're going to go ahead and launch it to the state. Like, whoa, okay. And I just also want to unpack a lot of people talk about technology getting in between people, but just the notion that, if you can imagine what it would take from a planning agency to say, we're going to get more than 30,000 people and see what they think about this topic pre-internet versus post-internet. And just the ability to say, the thing is, this turned around in days for me. That's the thing I want to point out. This was not a 6-month planning process to be able to hear 30,000 people. This felt to me like a 35-second planning process that was just like, whoa, we're doing it. And developers were up all night and people were working on it. So maybe just segue that in the story, but it was like, this needs to happen. The conversation needs to happen. We need to hear from people. It was emotional to say there are people, their voices need to be heard in this moment. And you ran with that. So maybe you can segue that into the story of the actual exchange and some of the lessons learned and the sheer magnitude of, hearing from almost 40,000 people in a couple of days.
Well, from a practical standpoint, I like to follow the exchanges that we run to see where the thoughts are going, because oftentimes the AI engine for theming and me personally theming are I like to compare the two to see if I would theme it the same way that the engine would. And of course, within about 5 hours, it sort of overwhelmed my ability to do anything. I did personally read all of the quarantine thoughts, which came across at about 1.5%. So I think there were about 1,500 quarantine thoughts over the course of the statewide exchange. And we did read each one of them and decide whether they could go in or out of the queue based on the screening criteria. But we did find that after the first 4,000 or 5,000 responses, the next 30 were pretty consistent. So once the data set reached a certain size, the bars and the trends in the data didn't change a whole lot, but it was just very fascinating to just see the scale of it. And I've shared this with some of your team. We hit send on an email, and in 4 days, like 1.5 million different things happened between people logging on, people sharing thoughts, and people rating, and that's sort of a really interesting thing to wrap your mind around. And it started with one send, obviously, but it was amplified. So the six executive directors shared, and then the 169 superintendents shared, and then the parent Facebook group shared. So I mean, you start the ball rolling, but then you just sort of observe the ball as it rolls down the hill. And it doesn't happen without people contributing and sharing and participating all across the state. It was exciting to be part of.
Yeah, wow. So Jonathan, can you, why don't you run us through your deck here in a few minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions from everybody here. And we're going to run an exchange so that Kyle will get any questions. So why don't you just sort of give us the nuts and bolts in maybe 3 or 4 minutes, and then we'll use the last 15 around questions.
Okay. So you go to the next one, Kyle. There you go. So there are the big numbers. If you've run an exchange before, we had just under 40,000 people total. They shared 53,000 thoughts and 1.19 million ratings. There was a really interesting time on the Sunday night of the exchange where we were talking to the developers at about 10 o'clock East Coast time about whether we would keep the exchange open and get over 1 million ratings, or whether you guys wanted to risk crashing your system because of the volume of the traffic. Go ahead, Kyle. We did have a pretty good spread in terms of rural, urban, and suburban participation. You can see the numbers there. And again, this was one of the insights, that the original exchange with the one district was an urban district, but when you looked at the results of the statewide, it really mirrored it, even though there was a good spread demographically in the exchange. Go ahead. And also a fairly good representation of different roles. But the vast majority of the folks in this exchange were parents, and with a small segment of other roles, the second largest group obviously being faculty and staff. Go ahead. Yeah, so this is the AI themed analysis of all the thoughts. And I think the biggest thing to keep in mind here is, if you look at the right of the graph, the purple bar is a teaching and learning concern. And those bars are lined up according to the overall rating of the thoughts in that theme. And if you can't count them fast enough, I believe there are 12 themes that are higher rated than the first theme related to teaching and learning. And that's sort of the Maslow beats Bloom graph right there. So safety of our kids, the risk of infection, social distancing, the need to contain the spread of the virus. How do we keep clean and sanitized? What happens if I get sick? I have concerns about my family. How do we work with children who can't socially distance? I mean, the 90% of that exchange was around those health and safety concerns. This is go ahead. This is another view. So the previous graph was based on rating. This is a tile graph that's also available in the dashboard, that is showing the number of thoughts, not how highly rated they are. And again, all the different themes around health and safety. I just saw a chat question about, what do you mean by Maslow beats Bloom? You know, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you don't feel safe, if you don't have shelter, if you don't have food, it's hard to be a thoughtful and reflective person worried about critical thinking and creativity. So it's just about having to take care of people's personal needs and concerns before you can get to those deeper educational issues. Okay. And this is just a word cloud of all of the themes, all of the 50,000 thoughts. And you just get a sense when you look at that on just, this is word frequency essentially. And we asked it as an open-ended question, and that word cloud pretty much tells you where the state of Connecticut was at the beginning of May. Okay. And this was from one of the draft summary reports that I wrote. You know, if you go through the 250 highest rated thoughts of the nearly 50,000 thoughts, every single one of them at a 4.5 average rating or higher, every single one of them was a health or safety concern recommending a fall at the earliest restart of in-person classes. Based on the first exchange, there was a State Board of Education meeting a couple weeks ago, and there was a question of our commissioner about the student voice, and the Chief Performance Officer, Ajit Golaksparan, and the commissioner recognized that there wasn't a lot of student voice in the first one. So Ajit came to me and said, could we do this again, but ask students about their remote learning experiences? If we have to continue to do remote learning in the fall, what would we do differently? So we launched a second one. And as of this morning, a little over 17,000 students statewide had participated in that, shared about 18,000 thoughts, and they're coming up on 500,000 ratings. And this is a graph of the 1,000 or so top rated thoughts in that exchange. And you can see that the first bar is about more live interaction. Students want to see their teachers more. They want to interact with their teachers more. They want to improve the quality of online instruction, and they want adults to improve the predictability of the workload. They want them to even out the work and talk to each other so they don't overwhelm kids and make it difficult for them to do quality work. This exchange has been fascinating to watch for an entirely different reason. You want to go one more, Kyle, the last one? And this is the word cloud of the student exchange as it looked this morning. Again, this is overall word frequency of the thoughts that the students have shared. And, it's, when I look at these thoughts, kids want to go back. They want to be with their teachers, and they want to be with their friends, and adults want to do that too. And it's just, how do you overcome the barriers of doing that safely and improve teaching and learning in an online environment, should we need to use that again in the fall as well? I think that's it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jonathan,
Sure.
for sharing that.
Just before we're going to go to I want to unpack one. So I want to make two points. One is, so we're talking to like 17,000 students right now about education. We're crowdsourcing. Before we go to the question period, I can't miss an opportunity to unpack the thing that you just said around this, and then we'll head to it, because I think never in the history of anything has this been more important. This is the hierarchy of questions. This is Maslow. And the idea here is that effectively, as leaders, and there's many leaders on the call, and I take this white soapbox. I shouldn't have said white soapbox. I'm going to check I meant whitewash, whatever. I take this moment to be able to discuss that their safety and security is the most important thing right now. And that right today, if you're not talking about privilege, and if you're not talking about Black Lives Matter, and if you're not talking about that actually you can't have a conversation about what's possible. People are not willing to have a conversation about vision and purpose if their basic needs don't feel met. And right now, people don't feel very met as safety and security as it relates to racial prejudice. And therefore, in order to have a conversation, move people up, you actually have to ask the question, what's wrong, before you can get to ask what you can do to improve, what do we have in common, and all the things that leaders want to ask is just around what challenges are you experiencing. If you're not actually asking that hierarchy question, what challenges you're experiencing, you can't actually go and ask questions further up to say what's working well, how can we improve. Everybody wants to talk about what's possible and what wasn't possible before. But the thing I'm really encouraging brave leaders to do in this moment is be willing to ask the safety and security questions about what are the challenges you're feeling, what's on your hearts and minds today. That's my quick soapbox on this. Okay, Kyle, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Dave. And to that point as well, I think we're Jonathan alluded to this as well. This all started with a district exchange around this topic, and we're seeing these conversations happening on statewide levels, not just in Connecticut, but also now in New York and other places as well. But we're also seeing a lot of these conversations happening district level, and we're supporting districts do that as well. I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to now hear from you. We're going to crowdsource from all of you folks who are here the questions that are top of mind for you. So this is a really simple exchange question here. What thoughts or questions do you have for either Dave or Jonathan? And we're going to take about 3.5 minutes. So feel free to participate. There's going to be a link just popped into the chat as well. So if you were not here for the first exchange, you can just hold up your phone and scan that QR code. You do not need to take a picture of it. If you scan it, if you hold it up to your camera, a little drop-down box will appear. You tap that, or you can click the link in the chat, or you can go to tejoin.com and put in that 9-digit code. All right, and I'm going to close this exchange so that we can jump into these questions. This is awesome, and the very top rate of thought for anyone who hasn't seen it yet is just thank you. And so, Jonathan, I think that's a sentiment shared across this group from all of us at Thoughtexchange and everyone who works in education. Just thank you for that. You care enough to listen to people. It does mean a lot.
I'm gonna make a quick comment on that, because I really love how this actually relates to the next thought. In that, as running this company now for a decade, I also want us all to check our privilege and say that giving everyone a chance. The only pushback I'd give is actually in the second thought, trying your very best as a leader to give as many people as possible the opportunity, knowing full well that technology and even the fact that you can't actually access everyone via email. And I think this is actually related in the second thought, which is that you try your best to hear from as many people as possible and to increase the number of people you've ever heard from before. And it's just a fraction of where we need to get to actually hear from everybody. So I just want to make sure that I double tap on that one. Maybe Jonathan, you can actually talk about this, and that we heard from 50,000 people. There's a lot more than that in the state of Connecticut.
Right. And, and it's a great thought. We did have two sort of mitigating circumstances in that in the early days of the immediate switch to online learning in the state, there was really a tremendous effort to distribute technology, increase connectivity, so more people who traditionally are disenfranchised from participating did have the opportunity in April than they would have in February, simply because of the state's effort to try to increase the infrastructure around remote learning given that switch. So it wasn't perfect, clearly, but it was better. We did offer it in Spanish as well. And I always think about this question because, yes, you can always do more, but having attended public meetings where I had 3 or 4 people show up to talk about a topic, to see, 40,000 responses, you're of two minds of it. You're proud of how many people you got involved, but there are always more people who could be involved. We did the best we could given the time frame we had to work with.
Using technology is the worst form of engagement, except for all others that have.
Right, exactly.
Thank you. Before we go into the next question here, I just want to acknowledge, I know that we are right at time here. We promised 45 minutes of your time. We're going to go a little bit longer and answer a few of your questions. So for those of you who are for the time we're willing to stay, we're happy to have you. We're going to go through some more of your top questions. And also, I just wanted to reiterate that there's a lot of work going on around across the continent right now, around the world, around all sorts of engagement questions. And so if there's any specific questions, feel free to follow up with either with us. There'll be some email sent out to you with our contact information. Feel free to reach out to us. We can always connect you with Jonathan as well if you have any questions there. but we're going to continue going through some of your top questions for at least a few more minutes. John, the next question is, how will you share the results?
So there are regional planning teams that were originally convened to help feed the commissioner and the governor's Reopen Connecticut plan with information as they met with constituents. So the summary report was funneled directly back to the commissioner and to those 6 regional groups. And so there was a direct sharing of the results through the summary report, but there's also an indirect sharing in that the 6 main buckets of concerns that came out of the exchange also were used to formulate the framework for going back to school planning now for the fall. So there was another chat question about what they were. So, how to plan to mitigate the spread of the virus, how to support the mental, social well-being of students, how to coordinate operations and logistics, coordinate the communication of reentry plans back to the community, teaching and learning adjustments, and how do you plan for a second wave closing that's possible for the fall. So those main response areas that we pulled out of the statewide exchange now are framing some of the back to school planning that is going on across the state as people think about how to create a plan that addresses these concerns. And it's a really challenging task because the landscape changes every day, and every new news cycle can bring out something that raises or lowers the sense of anxiety or security of the community. So this is a planning challenge like very few educators have ever faced, and we're just doing our best to frame the process to help give them a roadmap for the things that they have to deal with.
That's great, thank you. And that kind of leads into this question around follow up and what happens next. So there's 2 questions I'm going to sort of combine into one. The first one is more directed to you, Jonathan. Will you follow again with another exchange once you develop plans to return to school? But there's also a second one that's a little further down me that Dave can speak to. But it's asking to please share examples of questions districts are asking about their communities about preferences for returning to school in the fall. These 2 pieces around follow up and what that actually looks like in practice. So, Jonathan, answer that first one. I'll throw it over to Dave.
So there are already discussions around 2 other statewide exchanges, primarily focused now on back to school specific issues with specific feedback groups. So another one with parents, another one with specifically teachers. And so I think there will be more exchanges to come. One of the big challenges in doing the back to school planning work, though, is, and it gets to Dave's slide earlier about the hierarchy. Nobody wants to plan for the thing we have to plan for. So if you've got 10 back to school models, if you're using social distancing as part of your framework, then none of those 10 are what you would do if you could do anything you wanted. So sort of like you're choosing between 10, bags of junk. How do you, which of these is the least distasteful of the options? And so there's a group that really wants to use this as our opportunity to change the way schools work, but it's really hard to have a thoughtful, reflective discussion about how you would like school to be when you've got these health and safety parameters that preclude you from making many of the planning choices that you would love to make if you could do anything that you wanted. So that's sort of the conflict in trying to merge these ideas into a realistic back to school plan with social distancing as part of it.
Thanks, Jonathan. Dave, can I shift you into more of like a district level view as to what some of those conversations look like?
Yeah, I think I'll just touch on quick is So as a parent, I'm participating in a principal asking me about my thoughts and concerns. Our schools just went back in last week. I elected to not send my kids back. It's optional. So my principal reaching out to say, what are your thoughts and questions about us going back to school? Right now, there's questions about people working remotely. People, what are your thoughts and questions about coming back this year, next year? What are your thoughts about all the safety concerns? What are your thoughts? Actually, Kyle, if I can share my screen just for a sec, I don't have a script, but I'm going to go off it anyhow. This actually is something that I keep iterating, and this is thanks to Connecticut and the state of New York, etc. This, just to unpack this, I had to change this slide. Typically, this is our usage: 2018 in the bottom, 2019 in orange, and 2020 in purple. It sort of goes up at the start of the year, it trends off. Summer times, it's going to start to go down low. This is the first week of COVID. People are like, I don't know what to do. It's up 500% in the last 100 days. Our developers are staying up nights to keep everything on board, and that's because mostly education leaders in every district are asking students, parents, statewide or just a school-wide, everything from what are your thoughts and concerns, what's on your hearts and minds, or what do you feel the most important things are going to be as we have to think about budget cuts that we just heard about in our states, etc. Which unpacks to this. I have to acknowledge people just for this one, then I'll get back to you, is that the reason why this is so important is that in today of all days, that if you want to show people you respect them, just allow them to participate in decisions that affect them. And that's what's happening. So this is less about bragging about Thoughtexchange and more about bragging about leaders that are willing at this moment in history to hear back from people on levels that are completely blowing our minds. So you can ask anything that's on your heart and mind if you want to know what people think. If there's a decision coming up that's going to affect your staff or your parents or anybody, just ask them what their concerns and ideas are. So go back to you, Kyle.
Thank you. We're going to ask two more. We're going to go through two more questions here, then we'll stop it here. But there's a question that was dropped in the chat here for the panelists. A question around when you offer exchanges in Spanish as well as English, are the responses combined into one set of data? And so the answer is you can actually have exchanges running into a multilingual exchange. So they're live translated in real time in up to 104 languages. It's done through Google Translate, so it's not perfect, but it lets people participate in their native language, and then it combines all that data and translates it all into English for your data set.
I learned in this exchange, and I'm doing another bilingual exchange currently for another district on Portrait of the Graduate. And when a thought goes into quarantine, if it's been translated, it makes a note of it in the thought. I know what the language of origin of the thought is, and I can review it in a translated form and make a decision about whether to keep it or not. So it does unify it. It's really quite slick.
Yeah, you know what? I want to make a comment to the leaders on this call. So the technology is there, people, meaning you can hear back from any language. Actually, people can participate in their language. It'll get translated in real time. They can rate in their own language. We do a pretty good job of being able to translate. The UI is professionally translated into Spanish and French, but also Google helps us do this. The reason I point this out is that actually the onus is still in the leadership. We're still not hearing, we're hearing tiny amounts of people in other languages. There are in every exchange, our host is 21 languages in a single exchange. But the thing that I like to just push on from a leadership perspective is that the technology is there. The belief that you'll listen to minority speaking other languages is not yet. That's on the onus of the leader to say, we actually have a tool that we can listen to you, right? And your voice will be considered in our decision-making isn't necessarily a reality that exists for people that don't have English as a first language. So the belief has to come first. The technology is there already to be able to hear from anybody in any language. But the people, to get them to participate, they have to believe their voice will affect the decision. And that's the indicator of whether they'll participate, not whether the technology is ready. So that's just go ahead, Kyle.
Yeah, thank you. There's two questions I'm going to combine and get into one. The first, come on back. There we go. Speaking to your state comfort level, open in nature, the question, and also combining with that, what advice do you give other statewide and provincial, province-wide leaders concerning this approach?
Well, I really have to give total credit for the exchange to the state commissioner of ed. Dr. Cardona is a fairly new commissioner. He just started when the new governor came in last year, and he's a thoughtful guy, just trying to essentially in the first year of learning his job when he was thrown into this really extraordinary circumstance. And when he saw the data, he came back very quickly and said, yes, of course we should ask everybody. So he, maybe if he had been in the job for 10 years, he wouldn't have acted so quickly, but he wanted to know. And he gave it a thumbs up very quickly, which allowed it to go out very quickly. So I give him a great deal of credit, and he okayed the second one in a similar fashion. So he's showing courage. He's showing a willingness to listen. He understands how different voices have to come to the table in order to create sustainable solutions for all. And really, the credit goes to him for having the courage to ask the question.
Thank you, Jonathan. And that courage, I think, is a great word, because it's indicative of what you actually need to ask these really vulnerable questions. And then I'm going to ask one last question here, and asking for 5, but I'll ask you just for your top 1 or 2. Just asking what, based on the feedback you received, what's your top priority looking at returning, planning forward to return to school?
Yeah, I mean, we, in working on these back to school planning documents, we sort of have a sense that there is a critical mass of safety and personal concerns, and you're planning to try to get most people below that level of concern so folks will go back, because we know until there's a vaccine or a reliable therapy, no matter what your plan is, there will be a percentage who will not send themselves or their kids into a public space. So the better your plan, the more complete your plan, the smaller that number, the more haphazard and the less detailed, the larger that number. And as I said earlier, that line moves with the news cycle sometimes, and with public sentiment. So it's challenging, but clearly the 5 priorities are making sure you can enforce social distancing, try to get as many young kids back as you can, make sure you can get as many truly vulnerable kids back as you can, and come back in a way that is prepared to go immediately back to remote learning if you need to. And part of the challenge is every single one of those priorities costs money. And at a time when, there just isn't any right now. So there's a lot of really challenging decisions need to be made in the next, 4 or 5 weeks, because if you're not ready for what you're going to do by the end of July, you don't have enough time to put it in place to make it go for the end of August. So it's going to be a busy summer.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. We've gone quite a bit over time. So for everyone who is still here, thank you for joining us. You all deserve a gold sticker for sticking around. And this has been a really productive conversation. So Jonathan, thank you. Dave, thank you to everyone who's here. Thank you for joining us. As I said, there's going to be a short follow-up email just to pass along our information, but also letting you know there's going to be a recording of us put together and sent out to you as well, so you can have this and review this. Any closing thoughts from either Jonathan or Dave?
I just want to thank Dave for Thoughtexchange. It's just one of those rare tools that is both meeting a specific need and extraordinarily easy to use. And that's when technology sings and helps advance the conversation. And I love your tool and I love using it. And thank you for all the work you did to support this exchange.
Thanks, Jonathan. I'll just say back to you and everyone on the call, thank you for doing this. We built a tool for courageous leaders. And it's just a pleasure we get up to serve the voice of the people that you're serving. So for everybody who's on the call, I just want to say thank you so much. And also just love and respect for everything, every moment you get out of bed and try to help all the kids and parents out there in this world. I think the most appropriate end is just so much respect for what you do and what you bring to the students and the communities that you serve. So Jonathan, for you and for everybody that you represent and for everybody on this call, thank you so much. And please be in touch around, we have some things coming up. We have some amazing thought leaders to talk about some specifics around school reopening. We have a session on engaging voice and budget planning that's coming up this week. We have a lot of sessions where we try to dig into where voice and money and decisions hit the road. So you're welcome to join those things, and we'll send you some information and really encourage you to come back and be part of conversations. Thanks, everybody.
Well, thanks, everyone. Bye now.